if Putin ever gives this up, if he ever accepts the ceasefire, he's got to go to the Russian people and say, 1.4 million casualties, and we didn't get all of Ukraine. We didn't even get all of Donetsk. We just got part of the Donbass. If he has to go to the Russian people and say that, will the Russian people say, oh, thank goodness, we're happy, we don't have to fight again, we don't have more people being killed? Or do they say, what, you're stopping? You were supposed to give us Ukraine as part of Greater Russia. So in other words, Putin can still get away with the lie as long as there are enough Russians who not only believe that the sacrifice is worth it, but who believe that Ukraine should be theirs.
Joining us today is Scott Lucas, Professor of International Politics at the University College Dublin's Clinton Institute. Welcome to our program, Professor Lucas.
Hello, Daniel. Hello, Sofia. Happy holidays to both of you.
Thank you, likewise. And let's begin our session with a new statement from U.S. President Donald Trump. President Trump said U.S.-led negotiations on ending the war against Ukraine were going, quote, okay. How can you assess the statement and current state of these talks? Where are we now in these negotiations after most recent round in Miami?
I think a good starting point when talking about the negotiations is always to set aside what Donald Trump says, because he's just posing for the cameras and he may not even know the details of where we are. I think if you want to talk about a statement, which I find a bit more interesting, it would be the Vice President, J.D. Vance, who I think is a little bit more in touch with what's happening. And Vance, for the first time this past weekend, backed away from the idea that we were fairly close to a peace settlement. He said, the discussions are quite complicated. And they are. But where we are, and your viewers are going to know this, is that Vladimir Putin does not want a negotiated settlement. He does not want to compromise on territory, especially his demands for the rest of the Donetsk region in the east. He doesn't want to compromise on at least the de facto recognition, if not the legal recognition, of occupied Ukrainian territory as being Russian. He does not want to compromise on Russia being kept militarily weak and indeed politically weak by restricting Western links and Western aid to it. And that is still the position after we have gone through the latest set of talks, which were the parallel talks that were in Florida this past weekend, where Donald Trump's envoy, the real estate developer Steve Witkoff, spoke with a Ukrainian delegation led by Rustem Umerov, the head of the National Security and Defense Council. And then he also spoke to Vladimir Putin's senior financial advisor, Kirill Dmitriev, who had come out from Moscow, I think in part to make sure that the Ukrainians did not sway Witkoff too much. Let's take a step back and talk about the issues that we know are still there to be negotiated and exactly where we are on them. President Zelensky said in the latest recent days, he said there's 3 areas that need to be resolved. First is territory. And by territory, I think we can again go back to the idea that Russia does not get the rest of the Donetsk region, which is fortified, which is strategic. And indeed, Ukraine has been saying they do not want to accept the American proposal of a demilitarized zone of that 20 or 22% of Donetsk. In other words, why should Ukraine have to withdraw from that part of Donetsk and Russia not withdraw from its part of occupied Donetsk and indeed the Donbass region? Now, it may be, and I'll be interested if there's any further information on this, it may be that there is room for negotiation for Ukraine to say, okay, we will accept a demilitarized zone in part of Donetsk that we currently hold. But the fundamental here is that Vladimir Putin, and he repeated this on Friday in his question and answer session, wants all of the Donbass. And indeed, he went even further on Friday and talked about that Russia should get historic territories. In other words, not just the areas it occupies in the east and the south, but by historic territories, you people know that he's referring to areas like Odessa. So there's no compromise there on territories because the Kremlin is not willing to compromise. Secondly, is the question of the Zaporizhia nuclear power plant, which is that the proposal, as I understand it from the Americans, was to split control of Zaporizhia between the US, Russia, and Ukraine, which is not going to work in practice. You can't have three distinct powers trying to run a nuclear power plant, one of the most sensitive areas in your country. Ukraine has to retain sovereignty over Zaporizhia. Now, whether there's a compromise where the plant can be run by the International Atomic Energy Agency, although it's Ukrainian, we could see if that might be possible. But certainly you're not going to have the Russians having any share of that plant. And thirdly, it's the area of reconstruction. The ultimatum to Kyiv that Witkoff and Donald Trump's son-in-law, Jared Kushner, developed with the Kremlin, specifically with Kirill Dmitriev, this top Putin advisor, was for the U.S. to get 50% of the profits from a reconstruction fund. And Ukraine quite rightly said, well, no, reconstruction funds are for us. We're the ones that suffered the war damage. You didn't. It's not there for Donald Trump and his people to make money. And so, again, whether there's a room for a compromise to give some type of token payment to the Americans or some type of sweetener to Trump, I don't know. But the fundamental is that Ukraine has to have sovereignty over its reconstruction. So you've got those three issues. What's interesting is what Zelensky has not mentioned as being up for negotiation, in the sense of that coming out of the meetings just over a week ago in Berlin, that I think from the standpoint of Ukraine has been resolved, and that is security guarantees. And just to remind, the viewers, security guarantees, what is being there on the table is that you do have Europeans in Ukraine to help ensure that a ceasefire is not broken and to ensure that Ukraine is defended if Russia invades again. And you have a U.S.-led air power in a neighboring country, say somewhere like Poland, that would protect against Russian invasion. So that idea of the NATO Article 5 light guarantee, where Ukraine is not in NATO, but it has guarantees from partners. At this point, Zelensky's saying, no, we assume that is there. That's not an issue which is up for dispute. I'll just repeat that over the past 24 hours, the Russians have come out with more statements which just reinforce the idea that they're not willing to compromise. They sent Kirill Dmitriev out to Florida to try to get Stephen Witkoff, whom they manipulate, to take a hard line with Ukraine. And back in Moscow, people close to the Kremlin were insulting Europe. They were saying that Europe should not be a part of this, that Europe had prejudiced, had corrupted the proposal that Witkoff and Kushner developed with Dmitriev. And then, of course, you had Vladimir Putin referring to Europe as Nazi piglets, whatever that means, but just this insult of Europe as being Nazis alongside the Nazi government of Vladimir Zelensky. So if Vladimir Putin is saying that the Zelensky government is illegitimate and that European security is not a legitimate concern, how do you reach a settlement?
Let's also cover another interesting statement from Russian dictator Vladimir Putin. He says that Russia can ensure security and temporarily halt strikes on Ukraine during the day of possible presidential general election. What is your take of this strategy by Russian dictator Vladimir Putin? Is it an offer for a ceasefire in exchange, like ceasefire in exchange for elections in Ukraine?
No, it's not serious. Look, if you were serious, Mr. Putin, because I'm sure you watch this program, you should, because it's brilliant, then you would have accepted the proposal which was made by Kyiv for a ceasefire over Christmas. Let people in Ukraine have their Christmas celebrations over these next few days. But what was your answer to that? You rejected the ceasefire, and then last night, so Monday night into Tuesday, you carried out, more than 600 drones, more than 30 missiles, attacking civilian sites and energy infrastructure across the country, again trying to break Odessa by hitting the port area as well as energy facilities. If you're serious about a ceasefire, let's start with that. No, you know when you ask me that question, Daniel, what the answer is, and that is that the Russian propaganda line is that the Zelensky government is not legitimate, that there have to be elections in Ukraine to get the right kind of government. And they have been trying to get their people in the Trump administration, Steve Witkoff, Jared Kushner, to back that line. And President Zelensky gave the appropriate response to it. And the appropriate response to it is that once there is a ceasefire, once this is stopped, then there will be elections within 60 to 90 days in Ukraine. And then we can have a process where the elections are conducted not in a position where people are in shelters or running for their lives or troops are fighting on the front line, but you can have elections at a time when there at least isn't fighting or people being killed from above. So, look, I'm sorry, but the fact of the matter here is that what has been on the table throughout 2025, because the Europeans and Ukraine made this clear, is that you can start with a ceasefire based on the current front lines. Russia can stay in its occupied areas. Ukraine holds the areas it controls. And then you can talk about territory. You can talk about political, economic, and military issues. So, until Putin responds to that, basically, any statement he makes goes in this ear, comes out the other, and goes straight into the garbage bin.
The NBC News article reports growing tensions between Special Envoy Steve Witkoff and Secretary of State Marco Rubio over U.S. diplomacy on Russia war against Ukraine. Witkoff has made sudden, poorly coordinated trips and raised security concerns, while Rubio favors a more traditional State Department-led approach that maintains pressure on Russia. Who can win in this battle over maintaining Ukraine peace talks?
I mean, the current question, as you and I talk here in December, is you have in a split Trump administration, which is split, which is the side that prevails, the side that believes in European security, or the side that's collaborating with the Kremlin. So, Sofia, you're referring to an article from NBC, the American news outlet, which details Steve Witkoff not only collaborating with the Russians, but keeping the Secretary of State, Marco Rubio, in the dark. And if you don't mind, I'd like to go beyond that article for a couple of minutes to explain why it is so significant. Connect the dots, as we say. One of the revelations in the story is that in April, Steve Witkoff went to France to meet the French president, Emmanuel Macron. Now, Marco Rubio was going to Paris as well because he was going to be having talks on Ukraine there. Now, the logical thing is that Steve Witkoff should have collaborated with Marco Rubio. They're in the same government and discussed what's going to happen. Witkoff did not tell Rubio he was going to meet Emmanuel Macron. And then Rubio found out about it and asked the French, can I come into the meeting? And they said, well, you'll have to ask Witkoff. They humiliated him. You have to ask the president's representative, the president's envoy. Now, eventually, Rubio did get into the room. But remember that this took place in April. Why is that significant? It was in April that the Russians hosted Witkoff in St. Petersburg and then in Moscow. This person, Kirill Dmitriev, we referred to earlier, Putin's top economic advisor, he gave Witkoff grand tours of these cities, and he told Witkoff about joint U.S.-Russian economic proposals that they could have. So Witkoff is already collaborating with the Russians. And indeed, from another excellent article this past week, we know that when the Trump administration came into office, the Russians had psychological profiles of Trump's officials. They looked at the psychological profile of Keith Kellogg, who was supposed to be the envoy to Russia, and they said, well, Kellogg's daughter, Meghan Mobb, she heads up a charity in Ukraine. We don't really want to work with him. So they sent a message through the Saudi Arabian prince, the crown prince, Mohammed bin Salman, and they said, Steve Witkoff, if you come to Moscow, Vladimir Putin might meet you. In fact, he will meet you. He might even release an American teacher who is being held on drugs charges, Mark Foley. But one condition, Mr. Witkoff, you cannot come with any State Department personnel or any CIA personnel. You cannot even bring a translator. And Witkoff did it. Remember when he met Putin and there was a Russian translator for him who had been provided by the intelligence services? So Steve Witkoff was working effectively on his own without Rubio. Now, fast forward to October. And again, why is this significant? And if you don't mind, I know it's a long story, but I want to walk you through it. Please remember that in mid-October, Steve Witkoff, without informing Marco Rubio, as far as we know, spoke to Vladimir Putin's top foreign policy aide, Yuri Ushakov. And this was at a time when the Kremlin was really worried. They were worried about U.S. sanctions on Russian oil companies, and they were worried that the U.S. might give Tomahawk cruise missiles. So Witkoff says to Ushakov, you need to have Putin call Donald Trump. Vladimir Putin called Donald Trump 2 days later. On October 17th, the day after that, in a meeting with Vladimir Zelensky in the White House, alongside Donald Trump, Steve Witkoff said, you should give all of the Donetsk region to Russia. Oh, and by the way, no Tomahawks. It was just after that, in late October, that Witkoff and Jared Kushner draft the ultimatum with Kirill Dmitriev. But as you mentioned, Sofia, how much of this was done without the knowledge of Marco Rubio? What we learn is this from the NBC article. After the ultimatum was drafted, the 28-point ultimatum, there were to be talks in Geneva between the U.S. and Ukraine, and indeed European representatives in Geneva. Marco Rubio was to go there. Steve Witkoff went to Geneva early to try to talk to the Ukrainians before Rubio could. Now, I can only speculate at this point why Witkoff did it, but I'll bet a few dollars on this, that Witkoff was going to try to get the Ukrainians to accept the ultimatum before Rubio showed up. Now, Rubio found out about this and he sped up and he got there so that this didn't happen. And as we know, Rubio helped undermine that ultimatum. So, sorry to give you the long story, but I want a couple of summary points here. One, Steve Witkoff, who is still with Jared Kushner talking to the Ukrainians, is someone who has collaborated with the Kremlin and has done so without informing the State Department and even the Secretary of State at times. Two, who are leaking these stories, such as the one that Steve Witkoff hasn't been informing the State Department. The people leaking these stories are the American officials who are unhappy with this, who want to make sure that Witkoff does not sell out Ukraine on behalf of the Kremlin. So Witkoff carries out the negotiations, but another faction of the U.S. government is saying, look, you can't trust him. Be careful. That's where we are.
I would like to continue on another topic about economic situation in Russia, especially perspective for the next year. The Washington Post reports that President Putin is driving Russia toward a potential financial crisis due to the war against Ukraine, with risks of debt defaults and even a banking crisis as early as 2026, even if the Kremlin maintains the hardest position in negotiations. From your perspective, how serious this economic situation could be during the next year, and when finally ordinary Russians will feel the full consequences of the war against a neighboring country?
It's a serious situation in the Russian economy, but I don't know if you can call it a crisis. Certainly a crisis that will end the invasion. Indeed, I think what you're seeing at this point is that Russia knows, because of the serious situation, they may not have an unlimited amount of time. So they are escalating the attacks on the air and on the ground. Where exactly are we with the Russian economic situation? This is the best way to approach it. Russian oil revenues could be down 50% by the end of the year. Now, that is the main source of revenue for the government budget, alongside gas revenues. If oil revenues continue to be reduced, the government budget deficit is going to increase. it is going to force the government to make further choices between spending on the invasion and spending on other things such as social services. And the proposed government budget for next year increases military spending, sharply reduces spending on those social areas, social welfare. We know that inflation unofficially is running between 20 and 25%, so that's going to be hitting Russians as well. We know in particular that Russians are cutting back on the food that they're buying for the holiday season, which is an interesting marker of how well off they are. So, for example, I found out this week, I learned something every week studying this, that red caviar, which apparently is something on the table in the holiday season in Russia, many Russians are giving that up this time. But we know more beyond that, that agricultural production is decreasing in Russia. It's at its lowest point since 2009 because of problems in producing the food and problems that people don't have enough money to buy the food. We know there's questions about the energy sector because of Ukraine's attack. I can go on and on. I can list all of this. But the point here is that when you run a wartime economy, you tell your people to sacrifice. You in Ukraine have had to sacrifice with a wartime economy that you did not choose, and you've endured it. Well, Vladimir Putin is hoping that Russians will endure his invasion economy. And I can't tell you when they'll say, hands up, we don't want this anymore. I think what you see is you see a slow erosion of day-to-day services in Russia. And then at some point, the Kremlin has to make a choice as to whether it keeps pressing ahead with the invasion. I've said, and I'll stick to this at this point, I'm looking at this point, the Kremlin may be having 6 to 12 months to try to break Ukraine. And if they can't do it in the next 6 to 12 months, then they may have to pull back. That opportunity may be gone. But the one thing that will save the Kremlin, that will save it, and it goes back to our previous discussion, is if, remember that the U.S. administration, because of the adults in the room, had put sanctions on Russian oil companies and on the buyers of Russian oil. That's why Russian oil sales have dropped so much. If the U.S. reverses that and lifts the sanctions on Russia's oil companies, which is what one faction wants, that allows the Kremlin to breathe again and to maintain the invasion.
Let's also cover recent remarks by Russian dictator Vladimir Putin and his year annual address to the nation, and more than 4 hours of taking questions of so-called ordinary citizens in Russia. So Vladimir Putin says he's not responsible for deaths in Ukraine of Ukrainian civilians and Russian civilians. And how can you assess, how can you read his behavior and rhetoric during that press conference?
He's a liar. I mean, that's the starting point. He is responsible for the deaths in Ukraine. I mean, he's the guy that invaded Ukraine. So if you're not responsible for the deaths of the invasion, who is? So, but that's what Putin is going to do. And a lot of Russians will know that. A lot of Russians know they invaded Ukraine, right? The question here is how many people are comfortable with the lie, right? And we just talked about how many people in Russia are comfortable with the sacrifice that they've had to make since the full-scale invasion began in February 2022. And what Putin is counting on is this. You see, if Putin ever gives this up, if he ever accepts the ceasefire, he's got to go to the Russian people and say, 1.4 million casualties, and we didn't get all of Ukraine. We didn't even get all of Donetsk. We just got part of the Donbass. If he has to go to the Russian people and say that, will the Russian people say, oh, thank goodness, we're happy, we don't have to fight again, we don't have more people being killed? Or do they say, what, you're stopping? You were supposed to give us Ukraine as part of Greater Russia. So in other words, Putin can still get away with the lie as long as there are enough Russians who not only believe that the sacrifice is worth it, but who believe that Ukraine should be theirs. Now, there may be a lot of Russians who don't care either way. They just want to get on with their lives on a day-to-day basis. But unless those Russians come out and stand up against the Kremlin and say, we demand that you stop, as long as they simply sit on their hands, then Putin can get away with this. let's be honest here. We need to be honest with the viewers. We need to be honest, I think with respect to, you will know this, those people in Ukraine, with how much you've had to endure. The biggest threat that Putin faced was in 2023 with the Wagner Group rebellion, when you had a faction that had ties to the Russian military who were saying this war isn't being conducted properly. But of course, they were saying that not in the sense that the war should stop. They were saying the war should be done differently so we can win. Once Putin put down that rebellion and killed Yevgeny Prigozhin, the head of the Wagner Group, he got rid of the immediate threat to his power. So, yeah, he can still lie. Now, I will add one more thing. It goes back to Sofia's question. What a lot of people in the West haven't noticed is that a lot of those 4 hours on Friday were spent by Russians asking questions about the economy or about the day-to-day life. They weren't asking questions about the war. I come back to this. Russians may be concerned increasingly with the state of the economy. And if the state of the economy gets far worse, then they'll care about the war. And then they'll say, you've been lying to us. So that's why the economy here is crucial, rather than whether or not they believe Vladimir Putin's lie at this point in time.
You just mentioned that 2023 was the most difficult moment for Russian dictator Vladimir Putin, when Yevgeny Prigozhin and his soldiers tried to take the lead in changing probably the Russian regime. What are the chances for the same scenario in case of Putin reaching a ceasefire deal or denying, rejecting ceasefire in any kind of scenario when the war goes on in the future against Ukraine?
Yeah, that's a great question, because there comes a point where if you're part of the Russian military and you've gone now more than 4 years, it's maybe less likely that you stop and that you accept the ceasefire, because it's like, got to keep going, got to keep going. In a bizarre way, it might have been easier when you were just, 15, 16 months into the invasion to say, we need to stop it now, right? But now, do they stop now? And they've leveled Pokrovsk, but they haven't occupied it. They haven't taken the rest of Donetsk. They haven't advanced that far in Zaporizhia or in Kherson. So I don't see a Russian military rising against Putin occurring because he won't accept a ceasefire. Now, if he does accept a ceasefire, then I think it becomes very interesting, because I do think Putin's going to have to sell the idea that somehow he won when in fact he lost. And how many people in the Russian military are going to oppose the ceasefire if Putin was to reach it and say, no, you need to keep going? How many people in Putin's own party? How many people in sectors that are allied to the Kremlin are going to say, look, we really don't accept this? And I think that's going to be an interesting calculation. This is a way of saying that I think Vladimir Putin should accept the ceasefire now. I wish he would. But there may be people in Russia who are even more hardline than Putin. Don't discount this. Because the thing about an invasion like this is it completely corrupts a society. It corrupts a society in that when those beliefs in right and wrong, those beliefs in what is just, they are completely obliterated. And there may be people in the Russian armed forces, in the Kremlin itself, who would say, under no condition do we stop fighting, under no condition at all.
Another interesting topic on which I want to finish our interview is the idea of President of France, Emmanuel Macron, to reopen a dialogue between him and Russian dictator. And how effectively can such a dialogue realistically be, especially taking into account Putin's hostile rhetoric toward European leaders?
It can't be effective in terms of, let me back this up. This story of Emmanuel Macron going to see Vladimir Putin or making the offer, I find it really, really strange at this point when you look at it. Because you and I, we've just discussed why Putin would be unlikely to accept a ceasefire. So what is it you're going to gain by going out there to talk to him. And we haven't heard anything more about what Macron's message would be, what the terms of discussion would be. So this is one of those cases where I got to put my hand up and say, it's a strange story and I don't know, but a bit of speculation and a bit of caution here. It could be that Macron is going to go to Putin and say, this is the best offer you're going to get. The best offer you're going to get is that you get to occupy Ukraine for now and that Ukraine does not join NATO. If you do not take this offer at this point, then we will put European peacekeepers in Ukraine. We will give the security guarantees to Ukraine, and you're going to have to deal with an even tougher Europe. That could be. I think to get specific about this, however, I think the answer to this might be that remember that the Kremlin has said that it will not accept European troops or European personnel in Ukraine. And that is a key element of the European-Ukraine proposal as part of the security guarantees. My speculation here is that Macron would be going to Moscow to tell Putin, we are going to be putting our forces into Ukraine, but to give Putin reassurances, this is to defend Ukraine. This is not to threaten you. In other words, the idea of mutual security guarantees for Ukraine and for Russia. I hope that is what he would be doing. But I also hope that Emmanuel Macron would not be the only European leader going out to Moscow. I actually think that it should be several European leaders going out to Moscow. Friedrich Merz, German Chancellor, Keir Starmer, the UK Prime Minister. I quite think the Finnish President, Alexander Stubb, should be going out there as well. Giorgia Meloni, Italian Prime Minister. In other words, if you're going to go talk to Putin in the Kremlin, you need to show a European united front. So I'm not sure that Mr. Macron listens to me, but hopefully he watches this program. And if he does go to Moscow, that message, first and foremost to Putin, must be that Europe stands behind Ukraine. You're not going to split us. Now let's talk about the terms for the ceasefire.
Professor Lucas, thank you very much for our discussion and for this insightful conversation, and glory to Ukraine.
Thank you, Sofia. Thank you, Daniel. Glory to Ukraine.
Thank you very much.